Sarah woke up to screaming. Someone was dying in the woods. Her hands shook as she grabbed her dead husband's gun. Indians kill white women, the town people always said. Never help them. They are dangerous. But the screams were so full of pain. Sarah's heart broke hearing them. Before watching full story, comment below from where you watching. Also like and subscribe for more stories. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon when Sarah Mitchell heard the first scream. It cut through the morning air like a knife through her heart, making her drop the bucket of water she was carrying to her small garden. Living alone on the Texas frontier in 1875 was dangerous enough. But Sarah had chosen this life after her husband died in the war. She couldn't bear to stay in the crowded town where every street corner reminded her of Thomas. Out here, 20 miles from the nearest neighbor, she found peace in the endless sky and the work that kept her hands busy and her mind from wandering to darker places. But this morning, peace was shattered. Another scream echoed across the prairie, raw with pain and desperation. Sarah's heart pounded against her ribs. Every instinct told her to run back to her cabin, bar the door and hide. The stories she'd heard in town about Comanche raids filled her mind with terrifying images. Women taken. Homes burned. Families destroyed. Yet something deeper than fear stirred in her chest. That was a human voice crying out in agony. And Sarah Mitchell had never been able to ignore suffering, no matter who was experiencing it. She grabbed Thomas's old rifle from where it leaned against the cabin wall. Her hands shook as she checked that it was loaded. She wasn't much of a shot, but the weight of it gave her courage. Following the sound, she walked carefully through the tall grass toward the creek that ran along the southern edge of her property. The screaming had stopped, replaced by low groans that somehow seemed worse. Sarah crept forward, using the cottonwood trees for cover. Her heart hammered so loud she was sure it could be heard for miles. Then she saw him. A young Comanche warrior lay trapped beneath a massive fallen tree branch near the water's edge. His leg was pinned, twisted at an angle that made Sarah's stomach turn. Blood had pooled beneath him, dark against the sandy soil. His face was pale despite his bronze skin, and sweat beaded on his forehead. He couldn't have been more than 25, not much older than Sarah herself. For a moment, they stared at each other across 30 feet of open ground. Sarah had expected to see hatred in his eyes, the savage fury the townspeople always spoke about. Instead, she saw pain, exhaustion, and something that looked almost like resignation. The warrior tried to push against the branch with his arms, but it was far too heavy. He fell back with a gasp, his breathing shallow and quick. Sarah could see he was losing strength fast. Every rational thought in her head screamed at her to walk away. This was a Comanche warrior. Her people and his people were enemies. If she helped him, he might kill her the moment he was free. If other warriors found her here, they would certainly kill her, probably after doing much worse. But as Sarah stood there, rifle heavy in her hands, she remembered something Thomas used to say, "The measure of a person isn't what they do when it's easy, Sarah girl. It's what they do when it costs them something." This would cost her everything if she was wrong. But she couldn't live with herself if she walked away and let another human being die slowly and alone. Sarah took a deep breath and stepped out from behind the trees. The warrior's eyes widened as Sarah approached, but he didn't try to reach for any weapons. Maybe he was too weak, or maybe he sensed she wasn't there to harm him. She couldn't tell. "I'm going to help you," she said quietly, knowing he probably didn't understand English. But her tone seemed to calm him. She set the rifle down carefully, far enough away that he couldn't reach it but close enough that she could grab it if needed. Up close, the situation looked even worse. The branch was enormous, probably weighing several hundred pounds. It had fallen from the old oak tree that had been struck by lightning in last week's storm. The warrior's left leg was completely pinned, and Sarah could see the bone was likely broken. She looked around desperately for something to use as a lever. There was nothing but smaller branches and rocks. The warrior watched her, his dark eyes following her movements. When their eyes met, he spoke a single word in his language. She didn't understand it, but his tone was gentle. Sarah tried pushing against the branch with all her strength. It didn't budge an inch. She tried using a smaller branch as a lever, but it snapped under the weight. Sweat was pouring down her face now, and she could see the warrior was getting weaker by the minute. Then she remembered the rope in her wagon. She'd brought it yesterday when she went to collect firewood. The wagon was still hitched to her horse, Belle, about 100 yards away. "I'll be right back," she told the warrior, pointing toward her wagon and then back at him. He nodded slightly, and she thought she saw understanding in his eyes. Sarah ran to the wagon faster than she'd ever moved in her life. Belle, her faithful old mare, nickered softly as Sarah fumbled with the rope. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely tie the knots, but finally she had one end secured to the saddle horn. Leading Belle back to the creek, Sarah tied the other end of the rope around the heavy branch. The warrior watched this with growing interest, and when he understood what she was trying to do, he began pushing against the branch with his hands. "Easy, Belle," Sarah called to her horse. "Pull, girl. Gentle but strong." Belle leaned into the rope, her hooves digging into the soft earth. The branch shifted slightly. The warrior gasped as the pressure changed, but he didn't cry out. "More, Belle. You can do it." The old mare pulled harder, and suddenly the branch rolled to the side. The warrior quickly dragged himself clear, collapsing on his back beside the creek. His leg was badly injured, but he was free. Sarah rushed to his side. She had some medical knowledge from caring for Thomas during his illness, and she could see the leg was broken but the bone hadn't broken through the skin. That was something at least. Without thinking, she tore strips from her own petticoat and soaked them in the creek. The warrior's eyes never left her face as she cleaned the blood and dirt from his wounds. He winced but didn't pull away. "This is going to hurt," she warned him, even though he couldn't understand her words. But when she began wrapping his leg with the makeshift bandages, he seemed to understand her tone. He gritted his teeth and endured the pain without making a sound. When she finished, Sarah sat back on her heels. They looked at each other in silence. She had just helped a Comanche warrior, someone her people considered a deadly enemy. He had just allowed a white woman to tend his wounds, someone his people had every reason to hate. The warrior struggled to sit up, then reached into a leather pouch at his belt. Sarah tensed, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. But instead of a weapon, he pulled out a small carved piece of bone. It was beautiful, shaped like an eagle in flight with intricate designs etched into the surface. He held it out to her, speaking softly in his language. Though she couldn't understand the words, his meaning was clear. It was a gift, a token of gratitude. Sarah shook her head and pushed his hand back gently. "You keep it," she said. "You're going to need all the strength you can get." The warrior looked puzzled but didn't insist. Instead, he carefully put the carving back in his pouch. Then he pointed to himself and said, "Ayanna." Sarah realized he was telling her his name. She pointed to herself and said, "Sarah." "Sarah," he repeated, struggling with the unfamiliar sounds. She smiled despite herself. "That's right." Ayanna tried to stand but collapsed immediately. The leg couldn't support any weight. Sarah looked around, trying to figure out what to do next. She couldn't leave him here, but she also couldn't take him to her cabin. If anyone from town found out? As if reading her thoughts, Ayanna pointed toward the hills to the west and made gestures that seemed to indicate his people were that way. Then he held up 3 fingers and pointed to the sun, then to the western horizon. 3 days, Sarah thought. He was telling her his people would come looking for him in 3 days. Understanding flooded through her. If she could keep him hidden and help him recover for 3 days, his people would find him and take him home safely. But 3 days was a long time to keep a secret this dangerous. Sarah made her decision. There was an old line shack about a half-mile upstream, built by the previous owner of her land. It was run down but still had a roof and walls. She could hide him there. "Can you ride?" she asked, pointing to Belle and then to him. Ayanna shook his head but gestured that he could try if she helped him. Working together, they managed to get him up onto Belle's broad back. Sarah led the horse slowly toward the line shack, Ayanna swaying but holding on grimly. The shack was in worse shape than she remembered, but it would have to do. She helped him down and made a bed of sorts from old hay and horse blankets she found inside. Then she went back to her cabin to get food, water, and medical supplies. For the rest of that day, Sarah tended to Ayanna's injuries and tried to make him comfortable. He had several cuts and bruises in addition to the broken leg, and she could see he was running a fever. She made him drink water mixed with willow bark tea for the pain and fed him soup from her own pot. By evening, his fever had broken and he seemed stronger. As the sun set, Sarah knew she had to return to her cabin before someone came looking for her. It wasn't likely, but she couldn't take the chance. "I'll come back in the morning," she told him, using gestures to make her meaning clear. Ayanna nodded and touched his chest, then pointed to her. "Thank you," she understood. As Sarah walked back to her cabin in the growing darkness, she wondered what she had gotten herself into. 3 days seemed like forever. And what would happen when his people came for him? Would they see her as a friend or an enemy? She didn't know, but there was no turning back now. The next morning brought new challenges. Sarah woke before dawn, packed food and fresh bandages, and made her way to the line shack. Ayanna was awake when she arrived, sitting up against the wall. His color looked better and the fever hadn't returned. Over the next 2 days, something unexpected happened. Despite the language barrier, Sarah and Ayana began to communicate. He taught her Comanche words for things like water, food, and pain. She taught him English words in return. They used gestures, drawings in the dirt, and simple words to share stories. Sarah learned that Ayana was not just a warrior but also a healer among his people. He had been gathering medicinal plants near the creek when the storm struck and the tree branch fell on him. She learned that he had a younger sister named Kestrel and an older brother who was a chief. He learned that Sarah lived alone, that her husband had died, and that she stayed on the frontier because she loved the freedom and the wide sky. By the third day, Ayana could stand with the help of a walking stick Sarah had made for him. His leg was far from healed, but he could move around the small shack. They both knew his people would come for him soon. Sarah felt a strange sadness at the thought. She had enjoyed having someone to talk to, even in their limited way. And Ayana had been nothing like the savage enemy she had been taught to fear. He was gentle, intelligent, and had a sense of humor that came through despite their language differences. That evening, as Sarah prepared to return to her cabin, Ayana caught her hand. He pulled out the bone carving again and pressed it firmly into her palm. "For Sarah," he said in careful English. "Remember Ayana." This time she didn't refuse. The carving was warm from his touch, and she could feel the love and skill that had gone into making it. "I'll never forget you," she whispered. Ayana smiled and touched her face gently with his fingertips. Then he pointed to the hills and held up one finger. One day, his people would come tomorrow. Sarah nodded and tucked the carving into her dress pocket. She walked back to her cabin with tears in her eyes, knowing she would probably never see Ayana again. The next morning, Sarah woke to the sound of horses. Many horses. Her blood turned to ice as she peered out her cabin window and saw at least 20 Comanche warriors surrounding her home. They sat motionless on their painted ponies, weapons ready, their faces hard as stone. Sarah's hands shook as she reached for Thomas's rifle. But before she could pick it up, she heard a familiar voice calling out in Comanche. Ayana was with them, sitting tall on a beautiful spotted horse despite his injured leg. He was speaking quickly to the other warriors, gesturing toward her cabin. One of the older warriors, who Sarah guessed was Ayana's brother by their similar features, dismounted and walked slowly toward her door. Sarah's heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst. This was it. This was how she was going to die. But instead of breaking down her door, the warrior stopped and called out in broken English, "Woman who help Ayana. Come out. We talk." Sarah took a deep breath, left the rifle where it was and opened the door. The morning sun was blindingly bright, and for a moment she couldn't see anything but the silhouettes of horses and riders. Then her eyes adjusted, and she found herself looking into the face of the Comanche chief. He was older than Ayana, maybe 40, with scars on his chest and arms that spoke of many battles. His eyes were hard but not cruel. Behind him, Ayana watched anxiously. "You help my brother?" the chief said slowly. "Why?" Sarah looked from the chief to Ayana and back again. This was the moment of truth. She could lie, make up some story about expecting a reward. Or she could tell the truth and hope these men would understand. "Because he was hurt," she said simply. "Because he was human and he needed help." The chief studied her face for a long moment. Then he turned and spoke rapidly to the other warriors in Comanche. Sarah caught a few words that Ayana had taught her: good woman, brave, friend. When he turned back to her, the hardness in his eyes had softened slightly. "My brother says you save his life. Says you gentle like mother, brave like warrior. This is true?" "I just did what anyone should do," Sarah replied. The chief almost smiled at that. "Not anyone. Most of your people, they leave Ayana to die. Most of my people, they no trust white woman. But you different. Ayana different too. He see good heart." Sarah felt tears threatening and blinked them back. "Will he be all right?" "His leg. Ayana strong, leg heal. He live because of you." The chief paused, then made a decision. "My brother want to give gift. But gift not enough. You save life of son of chief. This means something important to Comanche people." The chief whistled sharply, and one of the younger warriors rode forward leading a magnificent horse. It was a paint mare, black and white with intelligent eyes and perfect conformation. Sarah had never seen a more beautiful animal. "This horse name is Star Runner," the chief said. "She fastest horse in our herd. Strong, smart, faithful. Like woman who saved my brother." Sarah gasped. "I can't accept this. It's too much." "Is not too much," the chief said firmly. "Is debt of honor. In Comanche way, life debt can only be paid with great gift. You know, take horse, you insult Ayana and all his people." Sarah looked at Ayana, who nodded encouragingly. She realized this wasn't just about generosity, it was about respect and honor between peoples who had been enemies for too long. "Thank you," she said, bowing her head. "I am honored by your gift." The chief nodded approvingly. Then he said something else, something that would change Sarah's life forever. "You are friend to Ayana's people now. Any Comanche who harm you or your home, he answer to me. You need help, you send message. We come." As the Comanche warriors prepared to leave, Ayana dismounted carefully and walked over to Sarah. His leg was still weak, but he was moving much better. The other warriors watched respectfully as he spoke to her. "Sarah," he said in English, then continued in Comanche, speaking slowly so she could understand some of it. He was thanking her again, telling her she would always be welcome among his people, promising that their paths would cross again someday. Then he surprised her by pulling another item from his pouch, a small bag made of soft leather and decorated with beadwork. Inside were seeds, Sarah realized. Garden seeds. "Corn," Ayana said, pointing to some of the seeds. "Beans, squash, Comanche food. You plant, you remember." Sarah accepted the seeds with wonder. "I'll plant them next to my cabin," she promised. "I'll think of you every time I tend them." Ayana smiled and touched the spot over his heart, then pointed to her. "Good heart," he said. "Sister heart." The chief called out something in Comanche and it was time for them to go. Ayana mounted his horse with obvious difficulty, but he sat proud and straight as a true warrior should. The entire band began to move, flowing like water across the prairie. As they rode away, Sarah stood beside Star Runner, one hand on the mare's neck, watching until the last rider disappeared over the hills. The silence that followed seemed deeper than any silence she had ever known. But it wasn't empty silence. It was full of possibility. Sarah spent the rest of that day getting to know Star Runner. The mare was everything the chief had promised: fast, intelligent, and gentle despite her obvious strength. It was clear she had been trained by someone who understood horses deeply. That evening, as Sarah sat on her porch watching the sunset, she took out Ayana's bone carving and turned it over in her hands. The eagle seemed to soar even in the failing light, its wings spread wide with freedom and grace. 3 days ago, her life had been small and contained, bounded by her grief and her fears. Now, somehow, it felt as wide as the Texas sky. She had made an enemy into a friend. She had been accepted by people she had been taught to hate and fear. She had been given gifts beyond measure. But more than that, she had discovered something important about herself. She had courage she didn't know she possessed. She had the strength to do what was right even when it was dangerous. She had a good heart, as Ayana said, and maybe that was enough to build a new kind of life on. The next morning, Sarah planted the seeds Ayana had given her in a special patch of garden beside her cabin. As she worked the soil with her hands, she thought about the unlikely friendship that had bloomed between a white woman and a Comanche warrior. It gave her hope that maybe someday their peoples could find a way to live in peace. Star Runner grazed nearby, and Sarah found herself talking to the mare as she worked. "You know, girl," she said, "I think we're going to have quite an adventure together." The mare lifted her head and nickered softly as if she agreed. Over the following weeks, Sarah's life changed in ways both small and large. Star Runner made traveling easier and safer, allowing her to range farther from her cabin to hunt and gather supplies. The corn, beans, and squash that grew from Ayana's seeds thrived in the Texas soil, providing her with new foods and a connection to a different way of life. But the biggest change was inside herself. Sarah no longer felt alone on the vast prairie. She knew that somewhere out there she had friends who would come to her aid if she needed them. She knew that courage and kindness could bridge even the deepest divides. She knew that her life had purpose beyond just surviving. 6 months later, as winter began to give way to spring, Sarah was working in her garden when she heard hoofbeats approaching. She looked up to see a small group of riders coming from the west, 2 Comanche warriors and a woman. As they drew closer, Sarah's heart leaped with recognition. Ayana sat tall on his spotted horse, his leg fully healed, his face bright with joy at seeing her again. Beside him rode the woman who could only be his sister Kestrel, and behind them, the chief. They dismounted near her garden, and Ayana walked over to examine the thriving plants that had grown from his seeds. He smiled broadly and said something to his sister in Comanche that made her laugh. "He says you have magic hands," Kestrel told Sarah in surprisingly good English. "Plants grow strong for you." Sarah learned that Kestrel had been educated at a mission school and often served as a translator for her people. She also learned that this visit wasn't just social, they had come with a proposal. "Our peoples have been enemies too long," the chief said through Kestrel's translation. "You show different ways possible. We want you to be, how you say, bridge between worlds. They wanted Sarah to serve as a go-between, helping to establish trade relationships and peaceful communication between the Comanche and the white settlers. It would be dangerous work. There were people on both sides who preferred war to peace. But it would also be important work, the kind of work that could change the future. Sarah looked around at her small cabin, her garden, her quiet life. Then she looked at Star Runner, at the bone carving she always kept in her pocket, at the friends who had ridden many miles to see her again. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "I'll do it." And so began a new chapter in the story of Sarah Mitchell, the white woman who freed a Comanche warrior from a trap and discovered that sometimes, what looks like an ending is really just the beginning of something beautiful and unexpected. The trap that had caught Ayana's leg had also trapped both of them in old ways of thinking about enemies and friends. By choosing compassion over fear, by choosing to see the humanity in someone different from herself, Sarah had freed them both. And in return she had been given gifts beyond measure: friendship, purpose, and the knowledge that one person's courage can indeed change the world, one act of kindness at a time. This story is a work of fiction inspired by the complex history of the American frontier. While conflicts between settlers and Native American tribes were real and often tragic, there were also many instances of cooperation, friendship, and mutual respect between individuals from different cultures. This tale celebrates the power of human compassion to transcend the boundaries that divide us.